In 1984, Pinklon Thomas raised the WBC heavyweight championship belt to the roar of tens of thousands. But the television cameras didn't capture the champion high on heroin, completely numb in the locker room just moments before. Don't think for a second the system didn't know. They knew everything. The promoters, the media, and the medical commissions actively chose to cover it up. They cleaned up the urine samples and kept pushing a man rotting from the inside out back into the cage. The climax hit in 1987 when they threw him into the jaws of a monster named Mike Tyson just to scrape the last few dollars out of his hollow shell. He was born on February 10, 1958, in Pontiac, Michigan. He was born into a military family. The defining characteristic of his early life was severe, unrelenting instability. The military lifestyle dictated constant uprooting. Before he reached adolescence, the family was transferred from Michigan to military installations in South Carolina, and then across the country to Washington State. For a developing child, this meant a total absence of a social anchor. Every time he stepped into a new neighborhood or a new school, he was the outsider. He had no established crew to protect him and no historical reputation to ward off predators. In transient, low-income environments, the new kid is immediately tested. Thomas learned early that diplomacy was useless. The only universal language across these varying zip codes was aggression. To avoid becoming a permanent victim, he had to project an aura of absolute volatility. He built a psychological armor constructed entirely out of preemptive hostility. The chaotic relocation finally halted when the family settled in Orlando, Florida. But this was not the sanitized corporate Orlando of theme parks and tourist resorts. The urban reality of Orlando in the late 1960s and early 1970s was fractured, deeply segregated, and saturated with crime. The environment was a pressure cooker, and the Thomas household offered no sanctuary from the tension. Paranoia was a family trait. His father and his uncles operated under a strict code of armed readiness. They carried loaded firearms on their persons daily as a matter of routine survival. Thomas grew up watching the adult men in his life treat lethal weapons with the same casual necessity as carrying a wallet. This normalized the concept that extreme, lethal violence was simply a standard tool for navigating daily life. Surrounded by this heavily armed, defensive posture, Thomas began to idolize the wrong figures. He was not looking up to athletes or civil rights leaders. His eyes were fixed on the local underworld. He studied the gangsters, the pimps, the extortionists, and the drug dealers who controlled the street corners. These men possessed the three things Thomas desperately wanted: unregulated cash, absolute autonomy, and the power to instill fear. The street hustlers operated outside the boundaries of the law and suffered no consequences, or so it seemed to a young boy. By the time he was 12 years old, the gravitational pull of the criminal element had completely consumed him. At 12, while most children were entering middle school, Thomas was initiated into narcotics. He did not start with gateway substances. The streets offered direct access to hard drugs. He was introduced to heroin. The early 1970s marked a devastating heroin epidemic that ravaged American inner cities, fueled by complex supply chains and a total lack of community intervention. Heroin acts as a profound central nervous system depressant for a child wired with anxiety, geographical trauma, and a hyper-violent environment. The drug provided a devastatingly effective off switch It numbed the paranoia. It erased the tension. It was the ultimate chemical armor. The progression of the disease was rapid and ruthless. Snorting or smoking the drug quickly lost its efficacy as his tolerance spiked. By age 14, Thomas crossed the definitive line from recreational user to severe chemical dependent. He became an intravenous user. Injecting heroin directly into the veins delivers the narcotic to the brain in seconds, creating a massive, unnatural flood of dopamine. It physically rewires the brain's reward circuitry. The adolescent brain, still years away from fully developing the prefrontal cortex, responsible for consequence evaluation, is defenseless against this level of chemical hijacking. Thomas was no longer making choices. His central nervous system was dictating his survival, and survival meant securing the next fix at any cost. But the needle delivered more than just a synthetic escape. It delivered a biological time bomb. In the early 1970s, the concept of needle exchange programs did not exist. Addicts shared syringes in shooting galleries, drawing blood and injecting it back into collective circulation. Through this exchange of contaminated blood, Thomas contracted hepatitis C. This is a brutal, stealthy, blood-borne virus. Once it enters the bloodstream, it attacks the liver. It does not announce its presence immediately. It operates silently, causing chronic inflammation. Over the years, this inflammation leads to fibrosis, replacing healthy liver tissue with dead scar tissue, ultimately driving the host toward cirrhosis, liver failure, or hepatocellular carcinoma. Before he was 15, Pinklon Thomas was carrying a lethal communicable disease that was slowly suffocating his internal organs. He had a viral death sentence circulating in his bloodstream, and he was completely unaware of it. At 15 years old, the facade of a normal life completely shattered. The rigid structure of the public education system was incompatible with the chaotic demands of a heavy heroin addiction. Thomas dropped out of school permanently. He severed all ties with conventional society and plunged headfirst into the underground economy. He was now a full-time street operative. To fund an intravenous heroin habit, a user requires a constant, substantial influx of unregulated cash. Thomas turned to the only trade he knew, crime. He became an enforcer, a thief, and a street-level hustler. His daily existence was stripped down to a primal predatory loop. Wake up sick, secure funds through extortion or robbery, purchase the heroin, inject, nod off, and repeat. He was operating in a violent subculture where life expectancy was measured in months, not years. The men he associated with ended up in state penitentiaries or morgues. Thomas was heavily armed, highly volatile, and completely numb to the consequences of his actions. He was a teenage ghost haunting the violent corridors of Orlando, waiting for the inevitable bullet or the fatal overdose to finalize his self-destruction. The street does not offer graceful exits. It offers the morgue, the penitentiary, or severe physical trauma. For Pinklon Thomas, the catalyst for change was not a moral awakening. It was a shattered mandible. At 18 years old, heavily entrenched in the Orlando underworld and carrying a lethal heroin habit, Thomas found himself in a street altercation that escalated beyond his control. The details of the fight remain buried in the unwritten ledger of gang violence. But the physical result was undeniable. A blunt force impact fractured his jaw, splintering the bone and wiring his mouth shut. This was a critical juncture. A broken jaw for a street enforcer is a massive vulnerability. You cannot eat, you cannot speak clearly, and most importantly, you cannot intimidate. The physical pain of the shattered bone was secondary to the agonizing reality of heroin withdrawal. With his jaw wired shut, his usual methods of securing cash for drugs were severely compromised. He was forced into a corner. The realization hit him with clinical precision. The street was going to kill him, and it was going to happen soon. Boxing was not a childhood dream. It was the only available mechanism for a violent, uneducated addict to generate income without catching a federal indictment. He walked into a boxing gym at an age when most professional fighters are already veterans of the amateur circuit. He had no foundational training. He had no pedigree. He bypassed the traditional developmental pipeline entirely, logging a pathetic total of 3 amateur bouts. In the brutal mathematics of boxing, skipping the amateur ranks is usually professional suicide. You miss the opportunity to learn defensive fundamentals, footwork, and ring generalship in a safe environment. But Thomas did not have the luxury of time. He needed cash, and the professional ranks offered immediate, albeit meager, paydays. He turned pro purely as an economic necessity. To survive against men who had been training since childhood, Thomas had to manufacture a psychological and physical defense system. He created an alter ego. The most visible component of this manufactured persona was his ring attire. He chose to fight in bright pink trunks. In the hyper-masculine predatory world of 1980s, heavyweight boxing, pink was considered a target. It was an invitation for ridicule and violence. But for Thomas, it was a calculated misdirection. The pink trunks acted as a psychological flashbang. Opponents and crowds focused on the glaring color, dismissing him as a novelty or a joke. By the time they realized the lethality of the man wearing them, they were already unconscious. Furthermore, the flamboyant persona diverted attention from the grim reality of his physical condition. No one expects a flamboyant, pink-clad showman to be hiding severe intravenous track marks and a rotting liver. It was the perfect camouflage. His physical defense system was equally pragmatic. Lacking the complex defensive footwork of seasoned amateurs, Thomas developed one of the most destructive left jabs in the history of the heavyweight division. This was not a flicking, point-scoring jab. It was a piston. It was a structural battering ram designed to keep aggressive predators at a distance. Biomechanically, he threw it with the full torque of his shoulder and latissimus dorsi, snapping the opponent's head back and blinding their line of sight. The jab was his physical perimeter. As long as he kept that left hand pumping, he kept the harsh reality of his opponents and the harsh reality of his own physical deterioration at bay. This raw, unrefined violence eventually caught the attention of the boxing establishment. Enter Angelo Dundee. Dundee was not a savior. He was a master technician and a brilliant manager of damaged assets. Having guided Muhammad Ali and Sugar Ray Leonard, Dundee understood the brutal economics of the fight game better than anyone. He recognized that Thomas possessed a freakish natural power and a sociopathic calmness under pressure, traits forged by years of armed street survival. Dundee took on the task of refining the street brawler into a marketable commodity. Dundee provided the critical missing elements: structure, discipline, and industry connections. He taught Thomas how to pace himself, how to pivot, and how to set traps. But Dundee's most crucial role was acting as a shield between Thomas and the parasitic ecosystem of boxing promoters. As long as Dundee was in the corner, the vultures were kept at a manageable distance. However, Dundee was a boxing trainer, not a clinical addiction specialist. He could fix Thomas's stance, but he could not cure a severe opioid dependency or reverse a hepatitis C infection. The training camps became temporary periods of managed sobriety, or at least reduced usage, strictly to pass pre-fight physicals and maintain enough cardiovascular output to survive 10 rounds. The heroin addiction was never cured. It was merely scheduled around the fight calendar. The culmination of this highly managed facade occurred on August 31st, 1984, in Las Vegas, Nevada. The opponent was Tim Witherspoon, the defending WBC heavyweight champion. Witherspoon was a seasoned, dangerous fighter, backed by the powerful promoter Don King. Thomas entered the ring as an undefeated challenger, carrying a 24-0-1 record. But the record was an illusion, carefully curated by his management to hide the internal decay. Behind the pink trunks and the devastating jab, Thomas was still an active heroin addict. The fight itself was a grueling display of attrition. Thomas utilized his piston-like jab to control the distance, neutralizing Witherspoon's overhand right. It was a clinical execution of Dundee's game plan. After 12 rounds, the judges awarded Pinklon Thomas the majority decision. He was crowned the WBC heavyweight champion of the world. In the eyes of the public and the media, it was a story of ultimate triumph. A man from the streets had climbed to the pinnacle of the sporting world, but the reality was drastically different. Winning the world championship was the worst thing that could have happened to Pinklon Thomas. The WBC belt was not a crown, it was a tracking collar. The moment the strap was placed around his waist, the power dynamics violently shifted. A heavyweight champion generates millions of dollars in television rights, site fees, and casino sponsorships. The scent of that money attracted a different caliber of predator. The street-level hustlers of Orlando were replaced by men wearing tailored suits and holding exclusive broadcast contracts. The protective shield provided by Angelo Dundee began to crack under the immense financial pressure of the championship machinery. A power vacuum opened up. The men who control the boxing industry, the promoters, the casino executives, the sanctioning body presidents, do not tolerate independent assets. They demand total control. They realized that Thomas was not a stable athlete. They saw the erratic behavior. They had access to the whisper networks confirming his heavy narcotics use. Instead of seeing a liability, they saw leverage. A compromised champion is an easily manipulated champion. The establishment moved in to isolate him. They began feeding his ego while quietly structuring contracts that ensured the lion's share of the revenue flowed upward. They realized that keeping Thomas just functional enough to enter the ring was more profitable than forcing him into long-term rehabilitation. The championship belt acted as a blinding glare. It distracted the public, the athletic commissions, and the press from the needle marks. The title legitimized him, making the media complicit in the cover-up. Reporters who suspected the drug use chose to write about the pink trunks and the devastating jab because exposing a sitting heavyweight champion would jeopardize their access and the network's investment. Pinklon Thomas had fought his way out of the Orlando underworld only to walk into a corporate cartel that was far more sophisticated, far more ruthless, and infinitely more dangerous. The street gangs wanted his cash. The boxing industry wanted his blood, his brain cells, and his legacy, and they had the legal contracts to extract all three. The armor had worked too well. It had delivered him directly to the slaughterhouse. The machinery of 1980s professional boxing was not designed to protect athletes. It was a highly specialized extraction industry. When Pinklon Thomas captured the WBC heavyweight championship, he did not conquer the system. He simply gained access to the executive level of his own exploitation. To understand the sheer scale of the abuse, you have to dissect the legal and financial traps set for him the moment he signed the contract to fight Tim Witherspoon. In the modern era, high-level athletes employ armies of lawyers and financial advisors to scrutinize every clause of a contract. In the 1980s heavyweight division, the promoters held absolute monopolistic control. To secure the title shot against Witherspoon, Thomas was forced into a standard yet predatory legal mechanism known as an options contract. This clause dictates that if the challenger wins the championship, he automatically surrenders the exclusive promotional rights for his next several bouts to the current champion's promoter. Often, this meant dealing with Don King. Thomas did not win his independence in Las Vegas. He signed a legally binding deed of ownership. He became a captive asset. The financial structure of these contracts was designed to keep the fighter desperate. The public saw the headlines, million-dollar purses, and massive casino gates. The reality of the payout was a lesson in corporate theft. From a negotiated gross purse, the deductions were immediate and devastating. The sanctioning bodies, like the WBC, took their mandatory percentage right off the top just for the privilege of fighting for their belt. Management took a 33% cut. The trainers and cornermen took another 10%. The promoter then deducted arbitrary expenses covering everything from promotional tours to the opponent's travel costs. After the IRS took its share, a fighter was often left with less than 20% of the advertised purse. For a functional athlete, this is a financial grievance. For an active, heavy intravenous heroin user like Thomas, it was a death sentence. Heroin dictates a severe, inelastic daily overhead. The promoters were entirely aware of his addiction. They did not intervene. Instead, they weaponized his dependency. They advanced him cash against his future earnings to keep him funded, ensuring he was perpetually in their debt. They controlled the supply of his money, which meant they controlled his physical survival. Thomas was trapped in an ironclad cycle. Fight to pay off the advances, use the remaining fractions to fund the heroin, go broke, take another advance, and fight again. The media was entirely complicit in this operation. The boxing press corps of the 1980s operated on a strict system of access journalism. To get the inside scoop, to secure the exclusive interviews, and to maintain the free flights and comped casino hotel rooms. Reporters had to play by the promoter's rules. You do not maintain access by exposing a reigning heavyweight champion as a junkie. The writers who visited Thomas's training camps saw the lethargy. They saw the erratic behavior, the missed sparring sessions, and the physical degradation. They chose to look the other way. They crafted a sanitized narrative for the public. They labeled his heroin-induced mood swings as championship pressure. They attributed his physical decline to lack of motivation. The media constructed a firewall of silence around Thomas, protecting the multi-million-dollar revenue stream generated by his title fights. They prioritized television ratings over a man's life. By 1985, the internal decay could no longer be hidden by a stiff left jab. Thomas defended his title against Mike Weaver in June of that year. He won by technical knockout, but the performance was incredibly labored. He looked heavy, sluggish, and disconnected. The heroin was accelerating the destruction of his central nervous system, and the untreated hepatitis C was quietly scarring his liver. A human liver compromised by the hepatitis C virus cannot efficiently process toxins or metabolize energy. It severely impacts cardiovascular endurance and muscle recovery. Thomas was stepping into 12-round fights against elite heavyweights with a failing internal organ and a brain chemistry completely hijacked by opioids. This brings the focus to the most damning failure in this entire timeline: the absolute corruption of the athletic medical commissions. State athletic commissions, particularly in high-revenue locations like Nevada and New Jersey, exist ostensibly to ensure the health and safety of the fighters. They mandate pre-fight physicals. In the strict biomechanics of boxing, a torn rotator cuff completely neutralizes a fighter's primary weapon in defense. For Thomas, it meant his signature left jab, the only physical barrier between him and incoming concussive damage, was functionally useless. He could not lift his lead arm without experiencing agonizing shooting pain. But heroin acts as a powerful synthetic analgesic. The heavy doses of narcotics masked the structural failure of his shoulder joint. He agreed to fight the most dangerous puncher on the planet, with one functioning arm and a central nervous system flooded with opioids. The Nevada Athletic Commission's role in sanctioning this event crossed the line from gross negligence into active, undeniable complicity. The pre-fight medical examinations for an HBO main event of this magnitude are supposed to be rigorous and uncompromising. Yet the state-appointed doctors signed the clearance papers for a man who was actively decaying in front of them. They ignored the fresh needle track marks. They ignored the compromised liver function. Most damningly, they ignored the torn rotator cuff that severely limited his mobility. Disqualifying Thomas meant canceling a multi-million-dollar television broadcast. It meant refunding thousands of tickets at the Las Vegas Hilton. The medical commission prioritized the financial security of the casino conglomerate over the neurological safety of the fighter. They legally sanctioned an execution. On May 30th, 1987, the reality of this corruption was broadcast to millions globally. Thomas survived the first 5 rounds purely on the residual muscle memory of his violent youth and the sheer, unnatural numbness provided by his drug use. He felt no pain, but a human body, no matter how chemically altered, cannot defy physics indefinitely. In the 6th round, the structural and neurological collapse occurred. Tyson cornered Thomas and unleashed a brutal 15-punch combination. This was not a sequence of scoring blows. It was a sustained rapid-fire application of blunt force trauma to the cranium. Watch the fight footage from a clinical investigative perspective. Thomas does not just get knocked out, his central nervous system completely short-circuits. The heavy hooks and uppercuts snap his head violently on its axis, causing the brain to ricochet against the inside of the skull. The final left hook severs his consciousness entirely. He collapses backward, his body going completely rigid as he hits the canvas, a textbook fencing response indicative of severe traumatic brain injury. The crowd erupted. The broadcasters celebrated Tyson's destructive power. No one in the arena, on the broadcast team, or in the press row acknowledged the dark underlying truth. They had just watched a 20-year-old phenom inflict permanent brain damage on an untreated, injured heroin addict who was pushed into the ring by corrupt promoters to generate television ratings. A sane, legally regulated industry would have permanently revoked Thomas's boxing license before he even left the arena that night. Instead, the promoters allowed him to recover just long enough to exploit him again. The absolute depth of the industry's depravity was exposed a year later. In December 1988, they booked Thomas against the rising undefeated star, Evander Holyfield. During the training camp for this fight, Thomas's body finally began to shut down under the combined crushing weight of the intravenous drugs, the viral infection, and repeated neurological trauma. He exhibited terrifying symptoms, slurred speech, and severely compromised motor functions, hallmarks of a severe neurological event. Yet the response from his management and the athletic commission was calculated silence. They actively ignored the screaming red flags, taped his gloves, and pushed a neurologically compromised man into the ring against one of the greatest heavyweights in history. Thomas fought on pure autopilot, absorbing severe, unnecessary punishment before his corner mercifully stopped the bout after the 7th round. The system had finally extracted the last drops of his physical capital. He was now officially useless to the machinery. The boxing industry does not issue severance packages. They do not offer pensions, comprehensive health insurance, or long-term neurological care. When a fighter is finally drained of his physical utility, the exit is unceremonious and immediate. After Evander Holyfield dismantled the stroke-compromised remnants of Pinklon Thomas in late 1988, the systemic machinery simply powered down and walked away. The phone stopped ringing. The promoters who once flooded his hotel suite with champagne and fake adulation vanished overnight. The television networks wiped him from their promotional materials. He was no longer a marketable commodity. He was a medical liability and a public relations disaster waiting to happen. The system discarded him with the clinical detachment of a factory throwing out a broken gear. The financial collapse was just as rapid as the physical one. The millions of dollars generated during his championship reign had never actually belonged to him. The predatory contracts, the exorbitant management fees, and the continuous cash advances from promoters had mathematically guaranteed his ruin. What little liquid capital he had left was immediately seized by the Internal Revenue Service for unpaid taxes, a direct result of his management failing to file proper returns while skimming his purses. The rest was aggressively drained by the localized parasitic economy that surrounds every addict, drug dealers, enforcers, and hanger-on. Within weeks of his final major payday, Pinklon Thomas, the former WBC heavyweight champion of the world, was completely bankrupt. He was thrust back into the street, but this time he lacked the ruthless vitality of his youth. He was 30 years old, but his internal biology resembled a geriatric patient. His liver was severely scarred by years of untreated hepatitis C. His brain had sustained repeated concussive trauma from taking flush hits from men like Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield. He was suffering from the lingering neurological deficits of a recent stroke, and running through this shattered physical vessel was a 15-year high-dosage intravenous heroin addiction. He descended into the absolute zero of society. He became a transient ghost, drifting through cheap motels, shooting galleries, and abandoned properties. The psychological torment of his situation was uniquely brutal. He was not an anonymous vagrant. He was a highly recognizable public figure. He possessed the physical stature of a heavyweight and the facial recognition of a man who had been broadcast to millions on HBO. Yet, he was digging through dumpsters and begging for cash to secure his next fix. The cognitive dissonance between his former global status and his current squalor fueled severe paranoia. The brain damage and the heavy narcotics use combined to create a terrifying psychosis. He was trapped in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, anticipating violence from the street while simultaneously fighting the agonizing internal violence of opioid withdrawal. The promoters who built mansions off his blood did not intervene. Don King did not send a rehabilitation specialist to find him. The Nevada Athletic Commission did not launch an inquiry into the welfare of their former licensed champion. The media, who had happily chronicled his devastating jab, completely ignored his disappearance. The boxing establishment operates on a strict code of silence regarding its casualties. Acknowledging Thomas's condition meant acknowledging their own direct culpability in creating it. They preferred him dead and out of sight over alive and serving as a walking indictment of their business practices. They left him in the gutter, fully expecting the heroin or the street violence to finish the job they started in the ring. The climax of this downward spiral occurred in February 1989. Thomas had returned to his birthplace, Michigan, completely destitute. He embarked on a catastrophic 5-day bender. This was not a recreational drug binge, it was a clinical death march. He flooded his compromised liver and failing cardiovascular system with massive quantities of street-level heroin and cheap alcohol. He was actively pushing his body toward respiratory depression and cardiac arrest. He was locked in a room, isolated, physically rotting, and mentally shattered. He had hit the absolute terminal velocity of his addiction. But on February 10th, 1989, his 33rd birthday, the unexpected occurred. The systemic machinery failed to kill him, and the drugs failed to stop his heart. As he lay in the aftermath of the 5-day chemical assault, a primal, deeply buried survival instinct activated. It was the same baseline aggression that had kept him alive as a teenager in the violent neighborhoods of Orlando. He looked at the reality of his existence. He was a stroke victim, a hepatitis C carrier, and a severe addict, but he was still breathing. He made a unilateral, unassisted decision to abort his own execution. He did not wait for an intervention. He did not call a promoter for help. He walked out of his isolation and checked himself directly into a local drug rehabilitation facility. The detox process for a 15-year intravenous heroin user is a physiological nightmare. It is not merely a matter of willpower. It is a violent biological rebellion. As the opioids leave the receptors, the central nervous system goes into severe shock. Thomas endured days of agonizing muscle spasms, bone-deep pain, violent gastrointestinal distress, and crushing psychological terror. His brain, structurally altered by a decade and a half of synthetic dopamine flooding, screamed for the chemical. He fought this war in a sterile clinic room, far away from the television cameras and the roaring crowds. This was the most brutal, high-stakes fight of his entire life, and there was no referee to step in when the damage became too much. He survived the withdrawal. He stabilized his brain chemistry. He began the slow, grueling process of unlearning 15 years of criminal and narcotic conditioning. He reclaimed sovereignty over his own nervous system. By 1992, Thomas achieved the impossible. He had maintained strict, uninterrupted sobriety. He had physically rehabilitated his body to a functional state. In a massive rejection of the industry that tried to discard him, he applied for and received a boxing license. He did not return to the ring to chase Don King's millions or to reclaim the WBC belt. He returned on his own terms, operating outside the cartel of the major promoters. He fought on smaller cards, controlling his own training and his own contracts. In late 1992, completely sober and clear-headed, he defeated Craig Payne to win the International Boxing Organization, IBO, heavyweight title. It was a minor belt in the grand landscape of boxing, but it was the most legitimate victory of his life. He defended his sobriety, proved his autonomy, and officially retired from professional fighting in 1993, walking away from the sport under his own power, on his own 2 feet. Pinklon Thomas's quiet exit from professional boxing in 1993 did not trigger a moment of industry-wide reflection. The multi-billion-dollar fight cartel did not pause to analyze how a heavily infected intravenous heroin addict was allowed to hold their most prestigious championship. There were no congressional hearings. The Nevada Athletic Commission did not overhaul its medical protocols. The network executives did not issue apologies. The machine simply wiped the blood off the canvas and moved on to the next disposable asset. The 1990s ushered in an era of unprecedented pay-per-view revenue. The promoters, the casino bosses, and the sanctioning bodies continued to print money, relying on the exact same predatory infrastructure. They needed a constant, uninterrupted supply of poverty, trauma, and desperation to fuel the factory. They just found new bodies to feed into the grinder. But Thomas was no longer their property. By surviving the withdrawal and walking away under his own autonomy, he committed the ultimate act of defiance against the system. The promoters had mathematically and structurally planned for his destruction. They expected him to end up in a penitentiary or a city morgue, comfortably out of sight, taking the secrets of their complicity to the grave. His continued existence was a massive operational failure on their part. Every breath he took as a sober man was a direct counterstrike to the industry that banked on his corpse. He did not retreat into obscurity, nor did he attempt to re-enter the corporate boxing landscape as a suited executive or a network analyst. He returned to the ground level. He took the decades of trauma, the street violence, the biological decay of the needle, and the corporate exploitation of the ring, and weaponized it into a tool for intervention. He established Project PYNK, Pride in Neighborhood Kids. This was not a tax-deductible vanity charity funded by billionaires to generate positive public relations. It was a trench warfare operation situated in Florida, directly targeting the exact demographic he used to represent: young, at-risk youth surrounded by the gravitational pull of gang recruiters and narcotics. Operating out of gyms in the Orlando and Melbourne areas, Thomas stripped away the illusions of the streets and the ring. When he stood in front of a teenager leaning toward the drug trade, he did not offer platitudes. He offered forensic evidence. He showed them the faded track marks on his arms. He explained the permanent scarring on his liver. He broke down the brutal, inescapable mathematics of the underworld, the short life expectancy, the paranoia, and the inevitable betrayal. He possessed a level of credibility that no social worker or police officer could ever manufacture. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of street-level enforcement and the absolute peak of global athletic fame, and he systematically dismantled the glamour of both. When he taught boxing at the university boxing gym, he was not operating a factory to produce future champions for Don King or Bob Arum. He used the heavy bags and the sparring sessions as a containment zone. Boxing, in his gym, was strictly a disciplinary mechanism. It was a way to teach a volatile teenager how to regulate their central nervous system, how to manage adrenaline, and how to control aggressive impulses without resorting to firearms. He was teaching survival mechanics, ensuring these kids built the psychological armor necessary to walk past a drug dealer without engaging. He was actively sabotaging the pipeline that had nearly destroyed him. The ultimate legacy of Pinklon Thomas is a cold, unfiltered indictment of capitalist sports entertainment. His life story operates as a permanent legal exhibit, detailing how a massive, unregulated industry operates like a legal blood trade. They target the most vulnerable, broken members of the lower class. They take young men who have been fractured by systemic poverty and weaponize their desperation. They cover up lethal viruses, they mask torn tendons, and they ignore active, life-threatening addictions to keep the product on the television screen. They extract the physical prime, the brain cells, and the blood of their athletes, converting it directly into casino chips and broadcast ratings. And when the athlete's body finally collapses under the weight of the abuse, the system discards the empty shell onto the pavement and legally absolves itself of all responsibility. Pinklon Thomas was designed to be a casualty. He was a product of a hostile environment, heavily compromised by a lethal disease and legally chained to corrupt men who viewed his brain trauma as a viable business strategy. He was supposed to be a forgotten statistic. Instead, he outlived his oppressors. He outlived the street gangs of his youth. He conquered a 15-year chemical dependency. The machinery extracted his youth and his physical health, but it fundamentally failed to take his autonomy. He stands today not as a tragic victim, but as a hardened survivor. He is a living, breathing monument to the absolute corruption of the fight game, and a permanent reminder that the human will, when stripped down to its absolute core, can break even the most ruthless systems of exploitation.